Hello and welcome to this video. So before we get started with the actual content, I thought I would just introduce what this is. And this is a segment from a course that I created for the website Udemy, which is an introduction to Git, GitHub, and GitHub Actions, and how these three tools work extremely well together to maintain version control over repositories, and also for CI pipelines and software development teams. These three tools are very useful. So it's a course that introduces these three tools. If you've never worked with them before, or you want to look into them and get an idea of how they work, you can find that course on Udemy. It's entirely free. So I've linked it in the description below. The entire course is also available here on YouTube. I've also linked a course that I created that focuses specifically on GitHub Actions. So if you want to dive deep into GitHub Actions itself, you can find a link to that course in the description as well. So I hope this video will be very helpful for you, and if you find the content is useful, please do like the video and perhaps subscribe to the channel to look for more course content in the future. Hello and welcome to this section. Now, in this section, I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about some ways that you can enhance your GitHub experience. And I want to focus on two particular areas. One will be enhancing your workflow. And I don't mean a GitHub Actions workflow, I mean your day-to-day workflow. How you can get the most out of GitHub using its available tools. And I just want to give you some ideas, some examples that you can think about incorporating. And then we're going to look at some security concerns that I think even at this early stage are worth mentioning. If you're working with organizational code or code for a tool or something that's precious and private, you don't want to take chances with your security. So we should discuss some security measures and things that you should look at now already. So we're going to do that in this section. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to this lecture. Now, in this session, I'd like to look at ways that you can enhance or get more out of your GitHub workflow. And when I say workflow, I'm not referring to a GitHub Actions workflow file. I'm referring to your work process. So there are various tools in the GitHub UI that can enhance the way that you manage your repository, work with your team, collaborate, and deal with things that you need to deal with, whether they are issues, bugs, tasks, anything like that. And it's good just to look at what is available to you, and you can go and explore these tools in your own time and see if there are ways that you can utilize them for your particular use case. So let's get started. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is GitHub Issues. Issues is one of the tabs available in your repository. And issues are essentially discussion threads where collaborators can either share ideas or report bugs or plan features. It's quite common in very popular open source repositories to see issues used as a place where either bugs are being brought up so that those who have access to the code or who manage the code can fix those bugs, or for new ideas to be proposed using the Issues tab. You can link these created issues to code changes, you can assign them to team members, or they can be tagged, and this allows for better organization. It's easier to find certain things or to know what they refer to. And so to create an issue in GitHub for a particular repository is pretty simple. In the repository that you are in, you go to the Issues tab and you just click on New Issue. And once you've done that, you can then add a title or description, anything else you want to add, and assign it to a collaborator or label it, or just leave it there for somebody to look at who manages that repository. Now we also have GitHub Projects. Think of projects as a visual board where you can track tasks across different stages, like to do or in progress or done. There are other tools that also do this available on the market, but what's useful about GitHub Projects is that it is once again integrated into the GitHub UI alongside the repository. And so this makes it easier to see what's happening in your repository at a glance. It also allows you to see what still needs to happen, what's already happened, what's blocked, etc. And it's all once again in the same space. So if you want to set up a project board, you click on the Projects tab in your repository, you click New Project and you choose a template, and then you can add cards to represent tasks, or you can link them to your issues. And you can drag and drop these cards to update their status. So I encourage you, go and play with it a little bit. Go to Projects, go to the Projects tab and create a project and see how it works. It's nice to play around with it yourself to get a feel for how you use it. And finally, I do think it's worth touching on the repository README. Sometimes this can be a neglected part of a repository. It can be created automatically when you create the repository like we did, but then it just kind of sits there. But a good README file is like the cover of your project. It's the first thing that people are going to see. And it's often where they're going to find information on how to use the tool, or how to fix the tool, or how to get through certain blockages, or how to make changes, anything like that. So as you can see on the screen here, it provides an overview of your project. It has installation instructions, usage examples, and anything else that's important. So having a README that is well defined and kept up to date is very useful, and I would say very important. Now, if you create a repository from scratch, you have the option to create the README automatically with it, which is what we did when we created our repository in this course. But if you need to create one, you can go to repository, click add file, and create new file. So for example, in your text editor, if I'm in Visual Studio Code, I would click add file and create a new file, and then you name it capital readme.md, and the MD stands for markdown, and this is the language that GitHub uses that allows you to have columns and bold and italic and code all within your README. It's not just text. It can be a lot more interesting and colorful than that. So a markdown language is also something worth looking into. And once again, feel free to experiment with it and try using some of the markdown changes in order to change the way the text looks in your README. It just makes it more interesting than just a bunch of text, but it's also useful if you need to categorize information, for example, in tables and so on. So those are just 3 things that I think are very useful to know how they work and to make use of them at the appropriate times, particularly the README, but also issues and projects. Now in the next session, I just want to talk a little bit about how best to secure your repositories to make sure that you don't have any security vulnerabilities with this code of yours that's sitting in this repository in GitHub's UI. So let's talk about that next. Hello and welcome to this lecture. Now in this session, I want to just touch on some brief tips on securing your GitHub repositories to make sure that your code, your workflows, anything within that repository is as safe as you can make it. So let's get started. So what are some of the security risks associated with a repository? Well, a GitHub repository will often contain some critical assets. This is particularly true if you're running a tool or if you're working in an organization repository, right? The source code is in that repository, which is the backbone of your application. That's how your application works, right? And in some cases, that's information that's private. You don't necessarily want that to be available. It depends on what you're building. If it's an open source tool, that's fine. But if it's for your organization, that's private and you don't want that to be visible. You'll also often find configuration files, which will include environment settings, API keys, all sorts of things that are very sensitive and should not necessarily be seen by anybody else. And of course, there are collaboration tools in your repository which allows team members to work together. But if it's an open repository, those tools might be accessible to anyone unless it's properly secured. And a compromised repository can lead to code theft or tampering, can lead to exposure of sensitive information like a password or a token. And of course, it can damage your reputation or even damage your business. So these are the security risks that you want to be aware of when you are managing a repository on GitHub. Now, GitHub does provide several built-in features to help secure your repositories, and we're going to look at a couple of them in this lecture. But just to mention a few, you do have branch protection rules, which we'll look at in a moment, and these prevent direct changes to critical branches. So, for example, your main branch can have a protection rule against it. There is secrets management, which allows you to store sensitive information like API keys or passwords securely in a way that the values cannot necessarily be seen. Now, there's also dependency scanning, which identifies vulnerabilities in your project's dependencies. So if you're building something that makes use of some other open source tool, so your app or your tool uses that other tool to build itself, right? GitHub can identify if there are vulnerabilities or issues or security risks with that dependency and let you know if that's the case. And finally, code scanning, which will automatically check for security issues in your code base. Now, I want to look at 2 of these in a little bit more detail, which is the branch protection rules and the secrets management. So starting with branch protection. Branch protection rules ensure that no one, including you, can make changes directly to a critical branch without a review. So in other words, if you have a main branch, you can enable branch protection, which will prevent anybody from just pushing a change to that branch. And when you're running a tool, from a main branch of your repository, or an application of some sort, or it's an organization repository, this is extremely important because it's going to affect an app which might affect your users. So you need to be sure that only approved changes are allowed to go to that main branch, usually through a pull request or something like that. So this is why branch protection can be very useful. You can't have some user going AWOL on their own and just pushing things to the main branch. They need somebody to approve it. And so how do you enable branch protection? You can go to your repository settings and you go to branches within settings, and under branch protection rules you can add a rule, and then you can specify the branch name, let's say for example the main branch, and then you can enable some options, like you can require a pull request before merging. You can require some status checks to pass before merging. For example, a GitHub Actions workflow that runs some tests against the code. Those tests have to pass in order for that change to be merged to the main branch. And you can also restrict who can push to the main branch, so only certain people are allowed to actually push to that branch. So this gives you several options for controlling how code is added to a particular branch in your repository. Next, I want to talk about storing sensitive values. When your workflows require API keys, tokens, passwords, anything like that, you should never hard code them into your repository. Never. You should use a GitHub secret instead. If you want to add a secret to your repository, you go to settings and then to secrets and variables. And if you're going to use it in a GitHub action, you'll go to actions. And then you click on new repository secret. You give it a name. Usually this name is defined in capitals, doesn't have to be. And then you add the value in the block. Once you save it, you cannot see that value again. That is so that it isn't possible for anybody to see the value. So if it's a password, say for an account, like let's say a Docker account or something that you're going to log into from your GitHub Actions workflow, you'll add that password value, and once it's saved, all you'll see are little bullets. You won't see the actual value anymore. But now you can call that value in your GitHub Actions workflow, and it still won't be visible, but you can fetch it. GitHub knows what it is, and it can fetch that value. So here's an example of that. Here's a GitHub Actions workflow, and toward the bottom here you can see we have a step here to log into Docker Hub. This is an action created by Docker for logging into the Docker Hub, and we're using a username and a password here. But if we had to write that in, if we had to hard code it, anybody who looks at the workflow can see the values. Instead, we save these values. There is a Docker Hub username secret and a Docker Hub token secret saved in the GitHub repository, and we can call it using the syntax where we have these curly braces and secrets dot and then the name of the secret, and then it will take that secret value and use it in place of this block over here. So this way you can still make use of your username and password without anybody seeing it. And so that's the end of this lecture. Just a few tips on how you can secure your repositories and also the content of your repositories, and also secure and control how changes are made to particular branches in those repositories. Hello and welcome to the end of this course. You made it. I hope that you've seen through this course how useful and versatile these tools are, not only on their own, but also as a unit. When they work together, they become extremely powerful, and they're excellent tools for working with a team, collaborating over long and far distances like across the whole planet, and also managing CI pipelines and development pipelines for your apps and your tools using GitHub Actions. So where do you go from here? I think the next logical step, if you want to go further with either of these, is to pick one or all of them if you want at the same time, and look for materials and resources that can dive deeper. Look for courses or online tutorials or free content anywhere, whatever you prefer, that will take you further with them. Look for new ways to use different commands and how you can manage GitHub Actions workflows in more complicated ways. Whatever it is that you feel you'd like to do next, that's what you should look at doing. Jumping deeper into one of these is the next logical step. Thank you so much for taking the time to work through these with me, and I wish you the best in your next steps. Thank you for taking the time to work through this video. I hope that you found it particularly useful. Remember, the entire course is available here on YouTube and also on Udemy, and I've linked the Udemy one in the description below. You can also find my course on GitHub Actions on Udemy if you're interested in diving deeper into GitHub Actions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and perhaps subscribing to the channel to look for future updates. Thank you so much for your time and have a lovely day further.